I think we can start the webinar. I'm Sophie Stalla-Bourdillon. I am a professor in IT, law and data governance at the University of Southampton and the non-executive director of the Web Science Institute and active member of iCLIC, an interdisciplinary research center based in the law school. Thank you so much for joining us today to discuss data governance issues related to the use of health data. Research in the field of data governance and then the recommendations for the creation of what the Open Data Institute called data institutions have been developed and released even before the COVID crisis, actually. So data stewardship and health data as a topic is not necessarily related to COVID. By way of example, the independent review carried out by Professor Dam, Wendy Hall, and Jerome Picenti, which reported on how the AI industry should be grown in the UK, recommended 3 years ago to facilitate the sharing of data between organizations holding data and organizations looking to use data to develop AI. Advances in the field of data science have meant that researchers have been eager to get access to data and more data, and more data, even prior to COVID-19. As you know, with COVID-19, access to data is becoming more critical, although I'd like to add that the quality of the data that is being produced in that context is far from being a given. Data stewards acting within or to support data institutions are seen as a key role to unlock the sharing and reusage of data. This is because whatever the contractual arrangement or corporate vehicle that is chosen, ultimately, assurances should derive from data governance best practices, which imply the ability to build risk assessment and risk mitigation into the entire data lifecycle. So today is the occasion to discuss obstacles to data sharing and better understand how these data stewards and data institutions could or are already helping to unlock responsible and sustainable data sharing. To do that, we've got a fantastic panel. We'll start with Sally Brailsford, who will kick off the discussion by saying a few words about her experience as best-in-class researcher working and trying to get access to health data. Sally is a professor of management science within Southampton Business School at the University of Southampton. And Sally's research is in the area of healthcare simulation modeling, and she's been evaluating treatments and screening programs to design and improve service delivery. She has tons of experience in the field and should have a lot of interesting things to say. After Sally, we will continue with David Seymour, who will give us an overview of the UK Health Data Research Alliance and its achievements so far. David joined HDR UK in June 2019 to lead the developments of the UK Health Data Research Alliance and other strategic partnerships. So he's very well placed to speak about the work of the Alliance and its achievements. We'll then pursue with Robert McCombe, who will discuss further findings coming from the ICO in the field of data institutions and help us hopefully identify some of the must-have for these data institutions and functions. Rob is a senior policy officer at the ICO. And then we will cross seas and go overseas with Alexsis and Elena. We'll speak about experiences and lessons learned from other jurisdictions, the Channel Islands and the United States. Alexsis is the founder of Lapin, pioneering new data governance frameworks to accelerate technology adoption and social good, and she leads the Jersey Data Foundation project. And Elena is co-founder and partner at Elida Consulting, a boutique privacy and data protection consulting firm in Silicon Valley. She leads, among other things, and many other things, the privacy team of the COVID Alliance. The COVID Alliance is a volunteer-powered non-profit coalition bringing together expertise across science, technology, and policy with a hope to build a coordinated response to COVID-19. So the webinar is meant to be interactive, and I will run the webinar in the following fashion. I'm going to ask questions to each of them, and then we'll take questions from the audience, 2 questions after each panelist, and then we'll have more time for a wider discussion at the end of the webinar, and I will take more questions at that time. Okay, so let's start, and let's start with Sally. Sally, you've been working with health and healthcare data extensively over the last 20 years, trying to get access to data for a wide variety of healthcare modeling projects to evaluate treatments, as I said, and then screening programs, allocate resources, redesign processes, and to improve systems. Things that are very relevant in a COVID-19 world. And this research stream is obviously becoming even more relevant, obviously, in a COVID world. Could you briefly explain how you've been working with health data and why facilitating access to data can make the difference in your field?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's actually 30 years rather than 20. And I started out, in fact, my PhD was about HIV modelling, so quite a few similarities with COVID-19, actually, a new virus that kind of spawned a lot of new research. So, I mean, I'm an operational researcher. I build models. In my discipline, these can be mathematical models. They can be simulation models like I build. Essentially, they're kind of replicating some real world healthcare system to answer a lot of questions. So they can be kind of clinical trials in silico, or they can be looking at the way that patients flow through a hospital and trying to optimize the use of resources. So I think the kind of models that I use have been more I started out in the former type, so looking at say screening treatments for things like cancer, diabetic retinopathy, and so on, where you want a lot of data. You want clinical data on the ways that patients progress through the different stages of disease, and then you also need experimental data, if you like, on the sensitivity and specificity of the tests. But then when you're looking at patient flow within an organisation or even across organisations, which more latterly I've been more interested in the flow of patients between the health and social care systems, where you're actually looking at how patients move from one part of the system to another and how this can be made more efficient and effective so that not only does it work better, but it's actually cheaper.
Okay, thank you. Have you ever tried to combine healthcare data and social care data?
Unsuccessfully.
Healthcare, health data in general is sensitive data and is obviously heavily regulated. What are the obstacles that you've encountered when trying to get access to this type of data? Are they more technical or organizational or legal? What would you say?
I would say certainly very rarely technical. So, I mean, just occasionally you have data that can only be accessed on NHS premises on certain machines, or is in some legacy system that doesn't talk to some other legacy system, and it's quite difficult to actually physically get hold of the data. But I mean, in like 99% of the time, I would say it was organizational. It's I think getting access to the kind of data that we need for our models, there aren't really systems set up to do this at the moment, because NHS ethics committees tend to assume that you're doing a particular kind of research, which where you can define your research question and your sample size and the rest of it in advance, which in my field you often can't, because we need to talk to people to understand the system before you even start modeling it. And that seems to be a kind of mode of research engagement that doesn't really align terribly well with the official processes. There are obviously ethical issues when you're looking at individual patient data. Most of the time we don't need patient identifiable data. Occasionally, as I say, particularly the kind of work where you're looking at patient flow between organisations as well as within organisations, there are difficulties that it's quite difficult to track because you only have an NHS number, you don't have an ID number in this country, and different organisations hold data in different ways. And I think when you're trying to understand whether how you can redesign patient flow within a hospital, say, you do need a certain level of clinical data. You need basic demographic data sometimes. Very, very rarely do we need patient identifiable data at that level. And there are many techniques that we can get around those problems.
So just to clarify one point, when you say we don't need identifiable data, so do you still need data at the individual level, or could you be working with aggregates most of the time?
I mean, it really depends on the kind of model and the research question that you're looking at. I mean, we need pseudonymized data at individual level, particularly in the kind of clinical, as I say, talking about those kind of computerized clinical trials, if you like. We obviously do need individual data because you need to know how different individual characteristics of a patient will result in a particular clinical outcome, and you want to predict quality adjusted life years and so on. You do need that, but we absolutely do not need to know whether it's Mrs. Smith or Mrs. Jones. We just need to know the characteristics of that patient, and we can often use synthetic data that's been recreated from real patients for that purpose.
So is this something that you've already used, synthetic data?
No, but it's something we've talked about as being a thing that would be incredibly useful for that particular kind of work. I mean, there are times when obviously you do need specific data about a particular location or setting. It really depends on the kind of model.
Okay, so aside from synthetic data, what could be done now to facilitate access to data? If you had to pick one specific barrier that we could eliminate today, which one would you choose?
I mean, if I could wave a magic wand, I think it would be to have access to a large pseudonymized data set that could be tuned to a particular location. So, I mean, I did think about this question quite a lot. Would I like a magic key to ethics committees and so on? I think I think that would answer some questions, but I think, I mean, I don't think there's one single thing that will suit every kind of modelling that can be used for, for some kind of benefit within the NHS. But I think a large part of the kind of tedious aspect of getting hold of the data in the first place could be overcome if it were possible to have some kind of safe, where there's guarantees on both sides, where the patients that contributed the data are guaranteed that they can't be identified, but then also the people that want to use their data for modelling, who really don't care about which particular patient it was, can be given a quick and timely way to access the data. I mean, I've had PhD students who spent the first 18 months of their study trying to get hold of the data. And, when they've only got 3 years to do it, it's just incredibly frustrating.
Not much, yes. Thank you so much. Do we have a couple of burning questions from the audience for Sally? Maybe it's only the beginning. We need to, yeah, I don't have any on my list, I think, if I'm doing things well. Let's continue. And I suppose we need a bit more time to think about this very important questions. We can go back to the discussion at the end. So let's continue with David. David, could you give us an overview of the Digital Innovation Hubs program and the UK-wide infrastructure for health data research and innovation?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you probably perhaps to make it easier for participants, I'll just attempt to share the screen so that I can just bring up a slide. Don't worry, I'm not going to spend my whole time on slides, but it's probably just best to explain. So yes, thanks very much indeed for the opportunity to talk today and to answer the questions. What I just want to lay out on the slide that hopefully people can see is I guess three sort of pillars, I suppose, if you want, of the Digital Innovation Hub programme. So the programme itself is funded by UKRI, the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, and it's a programme through until August 2022 at the moment. Started with a design and dialogue phase to really understand what the needs of the users were. But if we start all the way on the left-hand side of the diagram, what matters, I suppose, at most is the patients and the public. And as we step through this, the different pillars of the Digital Innovation Programme, firstly, the UK Health Data Research Alliance. So this is bringing together data custodians across the UK from national bodies such as NHS Digital, Public Health England, and the equivalent in the devolved nations. NHS trusts, particularly those closely involved with biomedical research centres, so typically the larger NHS trusts, medical research charities, so we've got Cystic Fibrosis Trust and the Brain Tumour Charity, and then also a set of sort of disease and sort of population-specific cohorts that sort of come on board. So the large ones are the UK Biobank, Genomics England, ALSPAC in Bristol, the Avon Longitudinal Study of Parents and Children, and Generation Scotland also just come on board. And really the alliance is all about, I guess they're the groups responsible for collecting or collating that data from patients, whether that's through routine care or through consented sort of involvement in studies and trials. And I guess looking after that data on their behalf. And what we want to try to do is establish those best practice principles for making that data accessible for research and innovation that can deliver public benefit. But regardless of where that research is from, whether they're from industry, the NHS, academia, citizen scientists, or medical research charities. In the middle then, we've got our health data research hubs. So these are, if you want, the digital innovation hubs. And there's 7 of these through this programme, spanning a number of different disease conditions, covering cancer, eye health, respiratory health, inflammatory bowel disease, etc. Also then one covering the acute pathway, so the Pioneer Hub, one looking at real world evidence with particular focus on diabetes, which is Discover Now, and then also one looking at clinical trials, so DigiTrials. And they're very much focused on improving that data and really sort of driving up data utility, but also offering research and innovation services to organisations and individuals wanting to use their data. And then the final sort of part or pillar of this is then the Health Data Research Innovation Gateway. So this was launched as a minimum viable product back in February and has now just been relaunched version 2. We're developing it with a technology partner, and the aim is that this becomes a portal really for users of various different goals to do, as it says there, discover, but also then access and also collaborate. And really it's a place for tools, techniques, and things to come together, but also as a route in to things like trusted research environments, which is sort of a parallel development alongside this. So the aim is that the Innovation Gateway doesn't actually hold any data or no personally identifiable data, but it's really as a sort of a route to enable a sort of end-to-end journey for researchers and innovators to access that data, to use it for patient and public benefit.
Thank you, Dave. Can you just clarify, so the gateway or the portal, does it, is it meant to be a third party in the mix, trying to make sure, in particular, de-identified data is being produced?
So in terms of the gateway, it's different functionality. So at the moment, it's very much focused on discovery. So we've got a metadata catalog where we're trying to onboard the data about the data sets for individual organisations and their data sets, predominantly those within the UK Health Data Research Alliance. so that people can then step through the next sort of layer is then the access management module, which we're developing at this sort of currently. And the aim of that is to try and harmonise the approach that different data custodians take to data access. And then that's, and then effectively what that will do is then build out through different models. How do we then do authentication of individuals through into trusted research environments? But the data itself within the gateway is basically only there to allow the processors to run. It's not, the data itself remains under the control of data custodians and remains sort of resident, if you want, in trusted research environments.
Okay. And so as we said, health and healthcare data is sensitive and heavily regulated. So if you had to identify maybe more specifically the blockers that the digital innovation hubs are seeking to eliminate, what would you say?
So through the design and dialogue phase of the Digital Innovation Hub programme, that ran through from, I guess it was sort of September, October time, 2018, through until the launch of the sort of competition for the hubs in May of last year. Effectively, people were telling us a sort of, I guess, 3 or 4 different things. Firstly, actual access to data. You know, as Sally was saying, you know, it can be really challenging, time consuming, for some instances quite expensive, both from resource and cash cost. And quite often people are left not clear how or where they're actually going to get hold of data. So access was a big issue for them foremost. Secondly, there was an issue about actually knowing what was available. So this is very much about the discovery piece. So actually, what are the range of assets? You know, particularly the UK health data research landscape is pretty fragmented. So actually helping people to find a way to understand what data is out there. And a third piece was then around, I guess, the utility of that data once you actually discover it. So how do you know whether the data that somebody has is actually going to be useful for your case, for your use case? How do we know whether it's sort of fit for purpose? And often when it's not fit for purpose, what's the effort in order to put into improving that data? And the final piece is probably then around sustainability. So actually, how is there a model whereby which access to data and investment in that data is delivered in a sort of sustainable way? So they were probably the challenges: discovery, access, utility, and sustainability.
When will the portal be available? That's the question from the,
so the minimum viable product, which surfaced 400 and something data sets at the metadata level, was available from the start of February. So as I can put in the chat once I've finished this, the healthDataGateway.org. And people can access that there now. We're building that out, and we're on a say effectively 2-weekly sprint with our tech partner to release different versions of that to upgrade the functionality. So the next developments around cohort builder, cohort discovery, but also then, as I say, the data access management module. So over the next 2 years now, we'll be releasing updates of that as we go. I'm very keen to do that. And yeah, so the tech partner is PA Consulting. So we engaged PA after quite an extensive procurement exercise, which concluded with a 3-way sort of bake-off or rapid development task. So we had 3 different suppliers running the same development task over an 8-week period. And at the end of that, we sort of selected PA as our partner, and they've been working with us for the last sort of month or so.
Thank you. Can you just clarify who are the data custodians in your model?
Yes, so the ones within our model, and actually I suppose I can possibly, it might be helpful to just bring up a second slide if I just share that screen. So effectively it's organisations like NHS Digital, but it's also NHS Trusts, it's sort of Biobank, it's Genomics England. So it's those types of organisations. So I think my next slide on should probably give you that. Yeah, so this is a bit more about the Alliance itself, but the Alliance is an open, sort of an inclusive, sort of gathering together really of organisations, say established as part of the Digital Innovation Hub programme, but really we're now up to 33 actually members, but they sort of cover those broad areas of national bodies that are sort of the national routine data set sort of controllers, custodians, the NHS trusts, particularly within England, those associated with those biomedical research centres, and then, as I mentioned, medical research charity and research cohorts. But we'll say it's open and inclusive, so if anybody's associated with organisations that would be interested to sort of come on board, then very keen to pick that up.
Okay.
And they're guided by principles of participation and sort of letter of intent, which again can make available.
If you have to recap and highlight the main achievements so far, what would you say?
So I think it's an interesting one, and particularly during COVID-19, it's been interesting to see how actually agile the hubs have been at sort of changing their sort of direction and engaging in the national endeavour. So I think I'd say that probably some of the achievements are around that sort of community. So DigiTrials in particular has been closely involved in the recovery trial, which obviously leads to some really important sort of discoveries in terms of what does and doesn't work on the therapeutic side. Pioneer have been leading work, particularly around some of the elements around ethnicity and understanding the impact on different ethnic groups and communities. Discover Now have been making their data set within the North West London integrated care piece available, and very much sort of managing that convergence between direct care, service planning, and also research, and really sort of, you know, developing an asset for one and using multiple times. So I think they're three of the things I'd highlight. And then within the Alliance as a whole, we've had quite a strong focus on building out the national capability in terms of trusted research environments. And so we've been reporting now fortnightly, but to the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies around the progress that's being made in terms of accessing health data, in terms of those linked data sets being available at a national level. And that's hopefully helped SAGE understand what's happening, but probably more importantly, it's provided a sort of focus for those different organisations to sort of work together towards a common endeavour. And
is there any lesson learned that you would like to share with the panel and the audience in relation to privacy and data protection?
I think there is really. I think I'd be very interested on Robert coming next, actually, because one of the big things that's come out looking across the 4 nations is the different interpretation. Well, firstly, different levels of infrastructure that's already in place, but more importantly, different interpretations, particularly around proportionate data and identifiability of data. So the data minimization question, particularly within a trusted research environment. And it is different across the 4 nations. And not all of those 4 nations have different legal sort of constructs. And I think actually cracking that as we hopefully move more and more of the situation where the analysis moves to the data rather than the data being released out into the sort of the wild, I think getting that tighter and more so coherently and consistently interpreted is a real lesson for me.
Okay, thank you so much. With this, we'll continue with Rob then. It's on you, Rob, to enlighten us about potentially de-identification and much more. Before doing that, could you give us a brief overview of the ICO thinking on and work on data trust and data institutions? And maybe tell us what's your view of the potential of these institutions and roles for health data?
Certainly, more than happy to. I think a very brief bit of background first. I'm part of the ICO's innovation department and in turn part of the strategic policy projects team, which is engaging with data trusts. And really, we're very interested in data trusts in particular as innovative products, as a means of ethically sharing data in a GDPR compliant fashion. Of course, this forms part of our wider engagement with data sharing as a much larger issue. That's something that my colleague Viv Adams is currently leading on. People will be aware that the draft guidance came out last year, and that's currently being worked upon with quite a few more products and a lot more thinking being done in those areas. We've also become increasingly interested in the value of data trusts and associated areas, particularly in light of COVID-19. There's increased demand and need to share and access data in ways that have often been considered too challenging beforehand, whether that's in terms of organisational barriers or potentially lack of understanding about the legislation. We're very much approaching these from the regulatory perspective to understand how they can function within GDPR and also what people's further understanding of the legislation is. We've recently done a lot of work with PHG Foundation on the sharing of genomic data, and something found there was really a lack of confidence in organisational and individual researcher-based understanding of the GDPR, what was permissible, what was actually personal data, and which bits of the legislation would apply under which circumstances. So it's forming part of some longer-term work that we're really undertaking. I mean, our engagement with data trusts goes back to the ODI's initial work with data institutions. We've been part of the DTEG group, advising at quite a high level on what we think are some of the key issues to really address. And from there, we've carried on, we've engaged with a really broad spectrum of stakeholders. We've been talking to people across business, the university sector, the third sector, and also other regulators about where they see this leading, what areas it touches upon. As has already been mentioned by yourself, this in many ways was kickstarted by Hall and Presenti's paper on AI and the resources it offers there, which ties into other areas of our work, but offers a lot of clear intersection with healthcare data. We've also come at these from other angles, such as smart cities, which again do have their applications for healthcare, for epidemiological management, and for potentially looking at areas such as local lockdown systems. I think what I would do is just touch very briefly upon some of those key areas and issues that we're looking to bottom out as part of our interest. I think clear among those would be what legal mechanisms are being used to transfer data outside of the GDPR. We're quite aware that the ODI found very quickly that UK trust legislation, for instance, doesn't really function with data in the manner it would need to. But there are alternative mechanisms. It can certainly be done. So I think we're really interested to see what laws, what frameworks would be understanding and interpreting in light of the GDPR. I think we'd also be particularly interested in areas such as basis for consent, basis for processing. There's been a lot of interest in consent. There's also been a lot of interest in research and legitimate interests. All of these are equal in the eye of the legislation, and all of them offer their own challenges and opportunities. What we're keen to do is to see which approaches people think best suit their models. Obviously, with regards to healthcare data, a lot of that will initially be research-based, but that's not to say that would cover all approaches and all further and future uses of the data. It may well move towards public task or a more commercial and therefore contractual or legitimate interest-based approach. And that will present quite a few discussions on how all of that will intersect. We're also interested in some of the other more theoretical areas, potentially such as consent by proxy, something that's being explored by some of Mozilla's researchers as a means of using data. So I think I will pause there before disappearing too far down the rabbit hole, but those are really some of the angles that we're beginning to approach data trust from.
Okay, so just to be sure, data institutions are potentially relevant for both identifying and non-identifying data. Yeah, is what?
Yes, very much so. Just to clarify, we're very much in favour of exploring these in understanding them better, particularly in any means that can really build public trust. That's been one of the key challenges noted by a whole variety of research, including the ICO's own public surveys. One of the greatest challenges is getting the public to fully understand and to agree with the use of their data in what are often very important ways.
So you mentioned legal basis. What else should be top of mind of researchers, entrepreneurs working on data institutions, in particular in the healthcare sector?
Quite a few things. I think just before I come to that, I would just like to clarify a quick point on identifying and non-identifying data, which is, as has already been touched upon by Sally on pseudonymization, there's not always a clear divide there. What will often seem to be non-direct identifiable data may still fall under the GDPR. It may not be pseudonymized to the point where it can't be recombined, where certain aspects of the GDPR won't apply. And certainly as a regulator, we'd also note, of course, that even non-personal data will at times fall under other legislation, such as the FOIA. And anybody using that information will need to be fully aware of the demands of those various bits of legislation. So just to swing back to your more recent question, some of the key questions I think we'd really like to see entrepreneurs and researchers addressing, first and foremost, is why a data trust? Why a data institution? What does it bring to the table that a pre-existing data sharing agreement or mechanism doesn't already offer? That's not to say that you don't have a very good answer, but it does need to be made. It's a new and novel approach, and therefore it does entail a certain degree of additional risk. And that's something that always needs to be justified. Other questions we'd really like to see answered are, who are the data controllers? We're talking about complex data sharing mechanisms. We're often talking about high-risk data moving around between multiple organizations. Where does the handover occur? Are we talking about single controllers? Are we talking about joint controllers? Is there extensive use of data processors? And how are they defined? Are they properly defined? And from thinking about the data controller, you've then got other issues, such as who then becomes data controller for newly generated data, for data that's inferred from contributed data sets as part of a data trust, for example. That's got implications, for instance, if a contributing organization or even an individual wants to withdraw their data. Is that possible? Will it have a catastrophic effect on the function of the broader organization? Because all of this will come back to understanding what are the rights of the individual, or more importantly, how can they be applied and enacted? Because the more complex the system gets, the harder it comes to maintain transparency, to understand which aspects of an individual's data are being used and who by and for what purposes. And those are certainly aspects we'd want entrepreneurs, researchers and organisations to keep first and foremost in their minds as they begin to set up these approaches. Now, I think a couple of the other areas I've already mentioned. What basis are you using for processing? Are you actually having to look at layering several bases? Are you moving from, say, a research scenario to one of medical treatment? That's certainly a challenge that bodies such as Genomics England, for example, have faced in their use of healthcare data. And again, it reflects that approaches can be developed, but they are often more complex than they first seem. Other areas that I'd suggest be considered include, certainly with a data trust, is it an independent entity? What mechanisms are in place to ensure that it's independent? And have they got the ability to take on all the attendant obligations that come with being a data controller? You've got to have the ability effectively to undertake a quasi-regulatory approach as you manage your data, as you respond to the obligations that you're under and to the rights that individuals have. I think, finally, also consider what governance and technological measures will you have to think about security and data minimization? What privacy enhancing technologies might you be looking at using? Are we talking about differential privacy, homomorphic encryption, or other areas? That, again, will all feed back in.
Okay. Would you have anything else to say upon purpose limitation and data minimization in that context?
I can certainly touch upon them briefly. I think there's a lot more to be said than I can cover in just a few minutes. As David's mentioned, these are really important areas, and certainly ones that provide different challenges in different areas. Certainly, first and foremost, these aren't areas that can simply be ignored. They're fundamental aspects of the GDPR, built very much into the legislation is that need for specified, explicit and legitimate purposes. Now, certainly a question we've been thinking about is how that sits with something such as a data trust, where one of the attractions and benefits is potentially flexible use of data. Certainly this is fundamental to good research, is while you may have a very strong research question, you still need to be open to new opportunities and new possibilities as exploration of the data continues. So there's an important question to be answered there about how that sits with a specific and explicit I beg your pardon. There's also, alongside of that, of course, data minimization. Now, that comes back to the issues of both what you collect, what you share, and also the technologies that you use to pseudonymize, for instance. So the question is there on data trust in one, can you have a flexible use of the data, or is it more about establishing a flexible means of access to the data? In that actually what you're doing is broadening the opportunity for previously unthought of organizations to both contribute and to draw upon the opportunities of that data. Something I think that's become increasingly important under COVID, but also other areas such as smart cities, where you're looking very cross-sector in how it's used. So I think that gives a very brief idea on the fact that we see these as very important areas, and there's certainly ones that require a lot more discussion.
Yeah, they are not always exactly straightforward. No. Thank you, Rob. Leaving the British shores, we are now going to continue with Alexsis. Alexsis, you've been working on data governance for quite some time, and in particular on multi-party data sharing, with the intention to create a model that could make the most of Jersey and Guernsey law. Could you give us an overview of the data foundation model?
Sure, yeah. Well, thank you very much for inviting me and letting me just share some of this model. We all know, obviously, that data is knowledge, and the premise really is that knowledge should be shared. So our focus has been on how to make the data more accessible in a responsible and sustainable way that can benefit society. And the whole challenge that we started to look at was really how can we facilitate this? And we started to ask ourselves, what are the pillars of data governance best practice that could be embedded in a concrete solution? And rather than starting where the UK started, we didn't really start with an entity. We started with looking at a good practice perspective and really examined what might be the things that would incentivize data providers to share more data responsibly. So this approach really started with working on a code of conduct, which brings to life the 6 fundamental components of best practice that are there for data sharing. But once that was then formulated, we realized that a code of conduct works much better when you have an entity in which you can actually demonstrate it. So we began to look at a number of different legal structures in the Channel Islands and looking for gaps and best fit. and we found that one of the ways to do this was actually through the Foundation's law, because the islands have a really unique law which supports really nicely transparency, collective decision making, and accountability. And in particular, it allows for inclusiveness around the decision making for large scale data sharing, where this involves a lot of data providers, and those providers could be competitors. The other thing that it allows, because of the unique nature of the law, is that the decision making can allow for representation of individuals within the structure. So there is a kind of reflexive nature to the governance structure, with feedback loops coming in from not only the data flows themselves and looking at the risks and mitigating them, but also a kind of continual improvement of the decision making, as this is the responsibility of the Council of Members. Really, the model is it has three main parts to it. There's the framework for sustainable data sharing, which is through a detailed code of conduct, and that does have in it ethical principles for driving data management behaviour. And then it also has the regulatory nature in the model, because we have looked at mature financial governance to actually apply that to data. And there is this element of regulatory oversight. And the model also advocates for independent data stewardship, because there is a very special role called the guardian in Foundations law. And if you apply that as a data guardian, you can really create some tensions in the model for independent oversight. So yeah, that's the kind of overview of the model. It really culminated in a white paper, and that was written in collaboration with Web Science Institute at the university, and we described in there a lot more detail about how that can be achieved.
Thank you for that overview. Building on that, if I understand well, the feedback that you received, and I have to include myself in this, obviously, because I've been working with you in the framework of an impact project to see how that could work. That you've received from regulators in the islands is that both Jersey and Guernsey laws can accommodate data foundations today. Why is it that we haven't seen any attempt to set up data foundations already? What is missing?
Good question. Well, I think there's a number of different elements going on here. And yeah, the regulators are really, really interested in this model, and there is a general consensus that they can support this, and it looks like the regulatory frameworks wouldn't need any large-scale adjustment to them. There's also a professional services ecosystem in the Channel Islands, which is mature in terms of fiduciary services offered to the financial services industry, and it would be a natural step to look at governance around data. And there is the islands are considered adequate in terms of the GDPR. So we can see that you know, if data is considered the new money, then maybe the financial services regulations are quite good in terms of the tensions that they create. But I just need to say, we're not advocating to put data in an offshore location. That's not what the model is talking about. We actually advocate for distributed data storage rather than pooling data. But I think that there are a kind of a few main reasons why the Data Foundations model is still really in its early stages. I think the first one is that there is a bit of a chicken and egg scenario going on, in that there's little incentive for the private sector to invest without having a working prototype. And you could say that the governments of the islands could use their own data to create that, and not just open data sources, but they could actually look at a particular use case and build a data foundation around that to prove that it works. But there are then challenges around the kind of entrepreneurial skills that you might need to be able to make that happen and make the model work. And also sources of funding, because we're now in a pandemic. So, you know, the funding is light when it's coming to these types of ideas. I think the second reason is around the fact that I think it sort of touches on what Robert's talking about, is that when it moves from, you know, in a health scenario, from research to being more commercial, then the data sharing has been typically around legal agreements, and you know, what does a novel structure in which to share data provide? And we're talking about collective decision making in this model. So I think that really takes some time for organizations to think about that. And as they face more and more challenges around data sharing and really complex data sharing, how is that done? And I think that partly this model is just a little bit early, but we can see that around the world there's task forces working on this. They are doing some really progressive and impressive work around different structures, the UK certainly, and particularly in countries where they want to dominate in development of artificial intelligence, because data sharing is so fundamental as a building block for that. So I would say the third reason really is around the fact that a lot of the arrangements for data sharing occur between organisations, and they are not as public as they could be. They occur in private organisations, and they don't necessarily have independent oversight that we are advocating for. And if you can prove that you're not processing personal data, and I recognise that's a spectrum, then the data protection regulators are not involved in that. So there's a kind of clarity and candidness that happen in data foundations, because the publication of the way that they work happens, and a transparency that's probably people aren't as used to. So that can create a bit of fear and a bit of the unknown as well. But yeah, I would say that probably lawyers and compliance experts, they're not necessarily going to test new and novel solutions, because they're not necessarily motivated to do that when they've got a proven model, I would say.
Just to be sure, I mean, do you see a potential for data foundation in the healthcare sector?
Yeah, absolutely. When I hear people talking about the kind of governance of healthcare and the kind of collective decision making, the public-private elements, and particularly when we come to the pandemic, because the whole thing of understanding the virus and tracking its spread and controlling the pandemic is an international problem. So you can absolutely see how a foundation could really support that and help. I mean, it's not just about adopting standards or one methodology or just the technology. It's the whole wrapper of the decision making around that problem that you know will increase openness. It will help the balance of interest. It will help patients and individuals get a voice, because they can sit in the council of members and be given the ability to veto decisions and that's codified in the charter. So yeah, I would absolutely that the kind of trust by design approach of a data foundation would work well.
And if you had to recap, what would be the main privacy and data protection challenges that you've been facing when working on the model?
I would say the model itself, we haven't distinguished between personal data and non-personal data. We've said this is good data governance, and the Code of Conduct advocates for that, obviously taking into account the particular requirements around privacy and protection. I think that that does challenge the regulators, because they're looking for the personal data elements. But I think that in the future, the definition of personal data will broaden, and good governance practices will come into play in a much wider format. I think people have already touched on challenges which are similar to the ones that are going on in the foundations world. But I would say that there is a kind of information asymmetry in getting hold of data sets, so that the kind of organizations who would be interested in creating a data foundation would typically have larger amounts of data. But you can see that there's also the connection to competition there. So the regulators for the competition authorities are also interested in how data can create this asymmetry, which plays out into societies and into economies. How does that work? So you get quite a complex legislative landscape, which is tricky to navigate, and it doesn't necessarily incentivize data providers to share the data. That's one of the challenges, but I mean, the other is, of course, that people have a strong and good growing awareness that their information is extraordinarily valuable, and that when aggregated, it can really influence the way the world works. So that can be a real benefit, because they are interested in sharing their data when they feel that it's for a good cause or something that they want, and they've got control of that. But that obviously needs to be incorporated into the models, and they need to be really comfortable and educated about what that means and what decisions that they can make. So that's quite in hot debate, I would say. Those are challenges we're looking at.
Thank you, Alexsis. Thank you for sharing your experience in the field. Let's go to the United States and pick on Elena's experience in the field. Elena, you've been working on privacy compliance for quite some time, and in particular as well on multi-party data sharing, with the intention to support organizations wanting to accelerate access to data in the US. Could you give us an overview of the work and highlight the main challenges that you've been facing in this context?
Yes, hi Sophie, thank you for having me. For some reason I'm having an issue with the video. I think the hosts need to allow me to be on video. But yes, thank you for having me. I've been working in the privacy and data protection field for over 15 years, and currently at iCLIC consulting with both companies, help them build privacy program, and of course data sharing is one of the biggest concerns. You know, and one of the challenges, of course, is regulatory challenge, dealing with different laws and regulations around the globe. But another thing is that our life has changed. We live, you know, and we live in the world of like flying cars and talking refrigerators, and that really affected how we kind of perceive privacy and data sharing. And, you know, I remember when I started working in privacy, like, you know, a long time ago, some of the major questions I had is a conversation with the information security team, thinking about who gets what, right? So, you know, nowadays the line between privacy and information security is getting blurrier and blurrier. You know, two disciplines cannot live without each other. But before, things were like, you know, I get one information security control or one information privacy control, but I cannot have both. And now, fast forward to today, things changed dramatically. During the last few years, not only the type of projects that we've been working on change, but also the approach towards privacy. For example, you know, of course, GDPR was one of the big influencer in how privacy being approached in the United States. On the top of GDPR, I don't know if, you know, you probably all have heard of the CCPA. It's a new California data protection law that regulates information collection, sharing practices. And there are other state privacy laws that we have that being implemented. and there are conversations about the federal data privacy law in the United States that makes it even more complicated. We still don't have the information privacy law on a federal level, but there are conversations that just influence other states and how states start thinking about privacy in a general kind of way. But some of the challenges I want to say is keeping track of regulatory developments. It's one of the, oh, here I am. This is one of the main issues right now. We have global data privacy laws. We also have state privacy laws. And in the United States, we also have many federal laws that regulate privacy. And for some people who might not be familiar with the United States data privacy laws, we don't have one federal law, but we have state laws in some states that regulate privacy. And we also have industry-specific privacy laws. For example, children, there is a specific privacy law that regulates information around children. Then there is financial industry. Then there is healthcare. So aligning all of these different laws and industry and different jurisdictions across the globe is a big challenge. And then applying it to business in a way that it's not only compliant, but also supports the growth of the business. So that's a big challenge. Another thing is just thinking about privacy not as a compliance check mark. This is another big challenge, big change I've noticed during the last 5 years, that privacy is not just a compliance check mark like it used to be. You do it once and that's done. It's work in progress. You constantly think about it. You think about how you develop your product from the beginning, thinking about privacy by design, thinking about how you tell your story to your users, to your clients, to your partners. Content matters. And thinking about why you are designing something, why you're building something, and being transparent about it, and telling the audience, whoever they are, why you're doing it is very important. And on top of being just compliant with privacy laws and regulations, just simple thing like telling your story the right way, the transparent way, become very important. So I think these are kind of like some main challenges that I've been seeing in the industry.
Okay, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the healthcare use cases that you are working on.
Yes, absolutely. So we have a variety of clients that we deal with, from like startups to Fortune 5 companies, and a couple of them I maybe like interesting to highlight. So for example, one of the client, it's a tech company, and they recently purchased a healthcare company. It's a very different mindset. Tech, especially in Silicon Valley, it's like very fast growing, fast paced, and healthcare many healthcare companies seems to be a little bit slow moving and a little bit more conservative. So aligning, learning about, educating the tech company, the parent company, about healthcare and training and creating awareness. It's a big component of our work with them. Of course, building policies and procedures and aligning the healthcare focused processes to fit the kind of like technology broader model of the parent company. It's a challenge. Also, another client, for example, we've been working on, it's a healthcare, so it's a technology tool that provides healthcare remotely. And the big challenge there is creating a platform that talks to different players. We have insurance, we have healthcare providers, we have patients, we have a mobile platform, and connecting different pieces and making it and doing it the way that is protecting patients' privacy, but also provide helpful information to all players. It's very challenging. Of course, information security plays a big piece, accuracy of data, availability of data, building privacy by design and data protection by design into the platform from the beginning. It's a big challenge. And of course, education and awareness, it's a big piece. I know many companies still overlook that, but just kind of like teaching how to think privacy, information security from the beginning of the business and the beginning of the product, it's an important component. It's basically creating your stakeholders in the room that will talk about privacy and security while you're not in the room. That's how I think about it. And sometimes, especially with tech, it's hard because their job is I have to build something, the deadline is yesterday and I need to deliver it. And very often things like privacy can be overlooked, not on purpose, but just because that by the nature of it, because it's not just laws and regulations, it's transparency, it's openness, it's accountability. And sometimes just forgetting to think about it can play a part. Another interesting client we have is also a huge company that is trying to use data in a way that protects patient privacy, and thinking about identification standards and developing identification standards for healthcare across the globe. It's a super interesting and challenging project, and many speakers already talked about identification. And so before I just want to note that there is no clear identification standards available, and it's been super challenging. HIPAA, that's the healthcare law, federal healthcare law in the United States, I think is one of the standards that's been around for a while. But even with those standards, there is lack of good guidance and implementation standards. And we've been helping the company to look at different global identification standards and create something that is based on some recommendations and best industry practices from different jurisdictions and aligning them with the business model. Very interesting, very challenging. No right answer, a lot of potential solutions, and it's just been testing them and changing them, and just again work in progress. And of course, another client we have is like Sophie, you mentioned, is a nonprofit organization that is focusing on COVID virus, and COVID Alliance is the name of the organization. Been working on finding a solution utilizing data from other sources available, public and private, to fight COVID, and providing data to researchers around the world and government and municipal agencies to provide the resources to patients, and also to municipal agencies like police and hospitals to navigate the pandemic. And the challenges, oh my God, so many of them outside of regulatory compliances, understanding first of all, what data do I have? Because the data has been collected not directly from patients or individuals, it's collected from data partners who have that data and being, they had this data for a while, and they either donating or providing that data for the good public use. And just understanding the data, how to use it, what do I need to have, and what is nice to have. And again, being content matters, right? Telling to users and to the industry, just the audience in general, what am I doing with that, and making sure it's done with trust and transparency, because it's not just complying with law regulations. It's so easy to ruin trust, and then it's ruined. It's like, that's it. The damage is done, and repairing is very hard. And so yes, so yeah. That's numerous challenges.
So what actually David mentioned was the metadata catalog is actually quite important for these data institutions. So the COVID Alliance is very much in the making. It's a baby data institution. It's being built in the US. If you had to describe briefly the distinction between US law and EU law, would you say that in the healthcare sector, US law is much more permissive than EU law?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I'm a former lawyer, so I would say yes and no. And I know people hate when lawyers answer this question like that. From one standpoint, US federal law on healthcare, it's called HIPAA, it's been around for a long time. It's been tested. There is a lot of guidance, so it's been around because it works in many ways. But because our life setting changed dramatically during the last few years because of the technology and the way we live our lives, the law is outdated. And it's been very challenging for standard healthcare providers like hospitals, not the startup and the technology piece, but the standard healthcare providers to reinvent themselves because of the very strict regulations such as HIPAA, and also the way how they just used to living their life and providing services, and the risk of patients and breaches, etc. So it's been challenging to change their mindset to be innovative and a little bit risky, but in compliance with laws and regulations. And again, just like thinking about transparency, that just disalignment makes it harder. But I do want to say that, yes, I think HIPAA and GDPR, they have their differences, but the focus, and actually the focus is different, right? So GDPR is focused on EU citizens, right? So, and their personal information. The focus of HIPAA is focused on healthcare organizations. So HIPAA doesn't apply to any type of organization in the United States. It applies to very specific insurance companies, clearing houses, and healthcare providers. So if you're a startup and you're not a doctor's office or insurance agency, so HIPAA will not apply to you unless you are a business associate, and I don't want to get into the weeds, and that means you're providing services on behalf of those three entities. So in a way, the focus is different, but I think the intention is the same. The only thing is GDPR, I think, is a little bit newer. Therefore, I think it can innovate. It's easy to kind of like apply to the current lifestyle, but at the same time, it's newer. And on the other spectrum, it hasn't been tested. And there are so many challenges the company is dealing with operationalizing the law, and it makes it very hard.
Okay. So to end briefly, what would you say should be a priority, top of mind for researchers, entrepreneurs working on data institutions, in particular in the healthcare sector? What would you say?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you for all the work you're doing, because we need to rationalize healthcare, and without your help, we can't do it. And pay attention to artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence being a tool that's been driving a lot of innovation, especially around healthcare. But also don't forget that AI will collect so much data that you just need to really know like what you need and why you need it. When you're designing solutions or searching for an answer, think about your why. What are you doing and why are you doing? So why, again, it's super important. Content, right? And think about, who is your audience? Is it the aging population? Is it the new disease? Is it the patient's expectations that have been changing, or lifestyle change? So think about that and just try to align always what you're collecting and how you're using it with that use. Always come back to your why, because that will drive everything. The creating a data sharing platform that can connect different players is important. And I know it's very risky business, but without interconnectivity, we can't find solutions nowadays. And it's very risky because it exposes us to different laws and regulations in different countries, but it also provides us with so many benefits, because we can help and build something together and utilizing each other's knowledge. Quality and availability is another thing. I think connecting those platforms help us with creating data that has more quality and use, and like becomes available to save lives. But at the same time, we need to have a lot of guidance and practices developed around that to regulate the data. Another thing is, again, liability, accountability, how the data, when you designing something, who's responsible for that? Is it an organization that providing services directly to the patients? Is it the researcher who's collecting data? Is it the data partner who's providing data? Just creating this type of clarity around your relationship, but also telling who's reliable for what to your audience, to the users is important. And last, least but not last, it's trust. And I know it's not directly written in many laws and regulations about privacy and data protection, but it's everything right now. Consumers do not feel in control of their data nowadays, and helping them feel empowered will help you, but also will help you as a researcher, but also as a business, to build something that is powerful and trustworthy, but also making difference in healthcare.
Okay, thank you. So know your data, know your purpose, and know your custodians. Thank you, Elena, for that. I will now look at the questions in the Q&A section. And we've got also some that were initially inputted into the chat box. If you've got more questions, please use the Q&A section. Sally, you mentioned synthetic data. And Paul is saying that synthetic data are satisfactory for checking that software works with data structures, etc. But it's really hard to generate synthetic data with the sorts of properties you need for a real investigation. How much scope is there really for use of synthetic data, would you say, if you can say?
I mean, I think it really depends on the kind of model that you're building. So I think if you're doing something like nurse rostering or operating theatre scheduling or something, then it really doesn't matter at all. I mean, I think synthetic data is absolutely fine for that. I mean, my own particular research tends to be more in a specific setting, and often there's a lot of politics and understanding the organisation, and the actual data that gets reported into patient admin systems and is routinely collected and so on isn't sufficient. And I think I completely agree that there are limitations to synthetic data because the devil's in the detail typically, and the issues that you're actually trying to look at for a particular hospital you won't be able to answer. But I completely agree that you can develop a model with synthetic data and show that it's useful. And often the battle is trying to persuade people to actually accept that the kind of modelling that that we do can actually be useful in practice. And in these kind of difficult political settings, it is often a really useful tool to have. And so I think if you can build a model with synthetic data that produces results that look sufficiently plausible and convincing to persuade people that if they gave you the real data, then they could actually get something really incredibly useful about it that would benefit their patients, then you know, I think it's the key to opening up that dialogue, really.
And yes, and if I'm not mistaken, regulators such as the ICO are also looking at the potential uses of that particular type of data. Sally, or others, could you comment on what is missing from existing data sets, CPRD, Employer Health Record, etc.?
Okay, I did try to start answering this in the text, only I thought it would take 5 hours to answer the question. So I mean, one issue is that a lot of those data sets you have to pay for. And so if you're a lone researcher and you're not in a department that has access to them already, they're not available. Another access issue is that they're collected for a specific purpose often, which is reporting to government or demonstrating that you're meeting some KPI in order to, well, you know, the millions of KPIs that NHS organisations are supposed to meet. And so they don't always contain that one crucial thing, and the one important piece of information that would actually enable you to actually do something really useful. And I think this is one of I think it was referred to, I forget exactly who it was, it might have been Rob that mentioned it, the fact that you can't always say in advance exactly what your data is going to produce, and that it can, I think, you know, particularly with increasingly powerful algorithms and machine learning and this kind of thing, that you can't say when you start exactly what the data is going to show and what issues it's going to raise in terms of patients' privacy. And so I think, you know, you can start off with thinking, yes, I need these particular items of data and I can build a model to show X, but then in the process of doing that, it throws up a whole load more questions or reveals things that were in the data that actually you then need to go back and say, if you can give me this extra extra data set, then I could do Y and Z and so on. And it's just really hard within the kind of regulations that exist at the moment to explain that to an ethics committee, that you can't actually say in advance precisely everything that you're going to need, because it depends on what kind of happens halfway down the line.
Would it be better to adopt a more iterative process in that sense? Break down the different research stages, maybe? What would you say?
Yes, I think, it's partly, it's just a different paradigm or sort of worldview of the way that researchers in my area that are working on practical problems. So we are working on, with specific organisations, but you can go back, of course, and have an amendment to an ethics approval, but you don't want to do that 15 times in the course of a 2-year project. So I do think it does need a paradigm shift in the way that we look at the way that data can be accessed.
And I guess that's another one for you. Looking at ethics committee settings, is there anything that we could improve there in relation to data access?
I think a greater understanding of where it's absolutely right and correct that there should be a very high threshold for accessing and use of data, and the fact that there are different kinds of approach of research that don't actually need, for which that's an irrelevant question, if you like, and having to go through the hoops of filling in forms where like 98% of the questions are not relevant, but you still have to answer them, and the one question that is actually relevant isn't there. So I think, this is where I think having a data trust would be so fantastic, because somebody has already thought about those questions and answered them for you, and you don't have to go through this process of explaining to a lay committee of ethics people what exactly you want to do with the data. That's been kind of dealt with before. Would be fantastic.
Okay, let's hope that's possible then. David, maybe that last question is we can start with you. You've been unpacking a very complex and sophisticated, maybe it's a better word, framework to facilitate the sharing of very sensitive data, to boost both research and innovation. Is there a place somewhere for big tech companies? How do you see the interaction with these particular stakeholders within your framework?
Very good question. I think this is where it's really important to be very clear on what roles organisations are playing in what space, and I think particularly when we think about, so one of the things we're currently working on, which I mentioned, I think was around trusted research environments, and I guess in a way taking a sort of fresh look at the 5 SAFEs model, and particularly around safe setting and what that means within the context of sort of public cloud computing, and how do we consider sort of accreditation on that piece. And so when we think a bit about some of the big tech providers that are perhaps providers in that space, we've got to be really careful about, what they are also keen to be very careful about, is a clear separation between their role as providers of that compute as distinct from those who are sort of interested in potentially what could be perceived as sort of harvesting data and accessing that data. And so that whole piece about sort of trust and what the roles of big tech is, if you want, in those projects is absolutely key. And I guess transparency about those agreements and those contracts, and that's obviously been part of the sort of the COVID story as well, I think is absolutely sort of pivotal to that. So I think there's absolutely a huge role for business in various guises, for-profit sector, in terms of that innovation and really driving that through. But we've got to be able to do it in a way in which we can build some public we've got to be able to build the public trust alongside that, and that's definitely not easy when we start talking about NHS related activities, and when we start talking about data, and we talking about big tech companies.
And going further, so do you have also a place for individuals? So data can come from institutions, but can they come directly from individuals?
I mean, I think again, that's been one of the really, certainly from our perspective, one of the really interesting things over the sort of the COVID-19 piece. So one of the early pieces of work I got involved in was with the Zoe symptom study app, and how we could make that effectively patient or person generated data and supplied data available. Obviously, it's got an app that pulls that together, but then how to make that accessible to NHS regions and to local authorities through the Sale Data Bank in Wales, as well as the research that Twins UK and others were doing on it. We've seen the same thing with some of the social care data, where again it's about the absolute paucity of sort of national data, but actually individually generated data is far greater. So I think it's sort of early space for us, and I guess with all of these, there's something which is acting as the data collector within there, whether that's an app or whether that's a different system. But that more direct connection between the sort of what flows from the individual into environments for research and innovation is an important sort of next step.
Okay, thank you. And maybe last question, maybe for Elena, to say something about the potential for anonymization in the context of data institution. Often, the way to avoid compliance issues is to claim that the data is being anonymized, and therefore it can flow freely. Is this really the case in practice?
Yeah, data anonymization, it's an interesting area. So there are a couple of pickles here. So one of them is like determining if it is truly anonymized, right? So just, if you think about anonymization, how it's described by different regulations is when there is no way to direct data, relate data to an individual or data subject, right? So, and that means looking at your data that you have internally as a company, or your partners, or any publicly available data, right? So, and for example, when we work with clients on identification, so we always think about like every possible data source, including social media. And very often that's where the last resort, where we find something that creates additional risk or wrinkle that we haven't thought about. So that's a challenge. Can you really say that your data is completely anonymous? That means there is no way to connect it to an individual. So that's one challenge. And second challenge is, will you be able to use data for business use when it's anonymous? Is it going to be helpful, useful? If data is going to be so naked, which always, that's one of the ways to anonymize data is to remove any identifiers, then it becomes like an issue. Well, is it helpful for me as a business or as a researcher to have data that is completely anonymized? And that's another challenge. And one of the things that HIPAA, the federal law in US, provides, one of the ways to de-identify data is to, like, safe harbor, remove all the identifiers. And very often that safe harbor method of de-identify data is not possible because the data is so naked that I can't drive any business value. So I think there is a potential here, absolutely. And there are ways for researchers and business practitioners to find a way how to make data anonymous while still helpful for the business, for use case. But I find it's very challenging. And one of the big challenges, how can you truly say that data is anonymous? And that's a difficult claim for me to state.
Okay, I guess we need interdisciplinary expertise here to be able to make the assessment. Time is over, unfortunately. I'd like to thank very much my panelists for joining me today. I hope the event was insightful. And if you want to know more about the different initiatives that we've been discussing today, please be in touch. We'll be very happy to follow up and give you more details about them. Thanks once again. Have a nice evening and see you soon.